ورجعنا لكم تاني في حلقة جديدة من برنامجنا بودكاست بالسكر. احنا النهاردة من ليفربول من مؤتمر دايابيتس يوكي 2026، ويسعدني ويشرفني ان يبقى معايا استاذ الاجيال استاذي بروفيسور روي تيلر، وهو احد العظماء في هذه المهنة. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Would you please introduce yourself to the people of Egypt?
Of course, with delight. I'm Roy Taylor. I'm a physician. I spent most of my life in acute general medicine, but increasingly specializing in diabetes. But all the way through, I've conducted research on metabolism, trying to understand how aspects of the body work and how the body manages sugar and fat. So that's the background to the research. And so that laid the basics for what was to follow.
Okay, sir. In this, I'd like to ask you about some of your more recent work. I know your accomplishments in this field. You have changed the face of of diabetes management of the world. My first question is: can diabetes be reversed? Can you not have diabetes any longer? Is it possible?
Yes, type 2 diabetes can be reversed most easily as soon as possible after diagnosis. But in the first 6 years, most people who lose a lot of weight can in fact get rid of their diabetes. So we came across this, not quite by accident, but we were trying to understand the cause of type 2 diabetes. Now, the cause is being clouded by many ideas about inflammation, about microbiome, about 6 different types, none of which has any sound scientific basis. But I've been working on metabolism of muscle, and then I moved on to the liver. But I'd taken steps to learn how to investigate what goes on inside these organs by using magnetic resonance spectroscopy and imaging. And in order to do that, I took myself away for a year in the United States to learn these techniques, which were just new at the time, being developed at Yale University. So I worked with Professor Jerry Schulman, and that's the basis of the techniques I used to unravel type 2 diabetes.
So basically, what MR spectroscopy is just a fancy term for MRI, or like an advanced for a fancy type of MRI.
Well, it's
more or less.
Yes, it's the essence of MRI, because all MRI is measuring the concentration of hydrogen in space. But in fact, the same technique can be used to measure certain other compounds, including carbon. And it's that we use to measure muscle glycogen, liver glycogen in the organs. And that was a very exciting thrust.
Okay, so you started using the MRI. What for?
Well, I wanted to answer a very simple question. Where do we put food after it's eaten? And starting off with studies on muscle, we discovered that in people with normal insulin sensitivity, 1/3 of the meal carbohydrate is stored in skeletal muscle within 5 hours after eating. Now, that was the beginning of the blow, but we went on to look at the liver, and the liver will be storing 20% of any meal. So far, so good. But of course, the open question was, what happens in type 2 diabetes? And we found in type 2 diabetes, muscle glucose storage is almost zero. It is negligible.
So in type 2 diabetes, carbohydrates are not stored in the liver after you eat?
Yes.
Okay.
They do get into they're stored in the liver, yes, but not in muscle.
Okay.
And that's very important, because it's often talked about as though insulin resistance was a whole body affair, but it's really very different in muscle and liver, because in muscle, there is the process of glucose transport to take glucose into muscle. But in liver, the door is open and the concentration of glucose inside the liver cell is the same as outside.
Okay.
So in type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance in muscle prevents a rapid uptake of glucose, but barely affects the liver. The liver is able to take up glucose because it goes in and out very freely.
Okay.
That led to all our studies on liver. So that was the way.
So what happens when the glucose goes inside the liver cells?
When the glucose goes inside the liver cells, there are only a small number of options. The glucose might be burnt, oxidized for energy immediately. It might be stored as glycogen. Well, the glycogen stores are relatively small. There's only a small amount of glycogen.
This is the normal storage of carbohydrates inside the liver.
And that is normal in type 2 diabetes because the door is open above the glucose. But if there's a lot of glucose, the liver can only put it in one direction, and that is making the glucose molecules into a long chain of fatty acids. Okay, so glucose is transferred into fat
inside the liver,
which is
fatty liver.
Well, that's the beginning of fatty liver.
Okay.
So just imagine your breakfast meal. A third of it was meant to go to your muscles.
Okay.
But if a person has type 2 diabetes, no, it doesn't go there. Where does it go? It can only go one place. The liver has to store it as fat.
Okay.
And this is a very simple concept that most specialists in diabetes don't quite get. Fatty liver gradually builds up.
Yes.
Because when the liver makes fat, it's preferentially stored in the liver. So you see, that's a big problem.
Why is this a big problem?
It's a big problem because the next step was we went on to demonstrate that insulin resistance in the liver is entirely due to the fat excess.
So the fat excess inside the liver cell makes the liver cell unresponsive to insulin.
That's correct.
Which is insulin resistance.
Insulin resistance. Now, in the liver, the important pathway that is affected is a matter of glucose output, because the liver is pumping out glucose all the time. Overnight, you will have made about 10 to 15 grams of glucose every hour. So in the morning, your fasting glucose is determined entirely by this process. But if the insulin can't restrain that and keep it down to normal,
it
reduced.
Okay.
So I could put together a series of ideas that were based on our firm observations as to what might cause type 2 diabetes. And that series of ideas eventually came to be on paper as the twin cycle hypothesis.
Okay. So now you have established, when was this, by the way? What year was that?
2006.
2006. So we're talking about a 20-year-old idea, more or less. Okay. So then you took this idea further.
Yes.
Okay.
Because here we have a hypothesis, and we thought we knew what caused type 2 diabetes. And that hypothesis would predict if we were to remove the main driver, which is the excess fat in the liver, then that would restore normal insulin sensitivity of the liver. Fasting glucose would become normal. The fat export, which the liver is responsible for, producing very low density lipoprotein, would go back to normal, and it's grossly raised in type 2 diabetes, and there would be less fat delivered to the beta cell. Now, this is where the clever thing comes in.
Beta cells are the cells which secrete insulin from the pancreas.
Secrete insulin.
Yes.
Because it's been widely appreciated. There are two big defects in type 2 diabetes. The insulin resistance. So there's the insulin resistance. But the other big thing is the insulin secretion from the beta cell. And These two have tended to be investigated separately as separate things. But the twin cycle hypothesis explained everything together because it was the excess fat exports from the liver that was producing too much fat for the beta cell, and they would be suppressed. And I shall say that.
You're saying that the fat inside the liver cells
Yes.
causes the beta cells not to secrete insulin properly.
Yes.
In addition, this is the other hypothesis, that the fat inside the liver cell causes insulin resistance, which means that the liver cells cannot respond properly to insulin.
Yes.
So it will continue to secrete glucose.
Yes. So we explain the high glucose level fasting, but also we explain why the beta cell is struggling with this excess of fat. And there were some very nice studies in animals from the 1990s that I knew of, exposing beta cells to excess fat caused insulin secretion to be lost.
Okay.
So that was a hypothesis. And the only reason for putting together a hypothesis is to try to destroy it.
Great.
So you try and destroy your own hypothesis. The biggest sin in science is to fall in love with your hypothesis.
Yes.
So we could destroy the twin cycle hypothesis by getting people to lose weight. And I calculated it was about 15 kilogram weight loss that would be needed. And then if all these processes we had identified did not return to normal, the hypothesis was wrong, and we go back to the drawing.
So basically what you said was, now we know as a fact that people with type 2 diabetes have excess fat in the liver. There is excess fat transportation to the pancreas. So what you were trying to say is that you proved that liver cells have excess fat. This excess fat is now transported to pancreatic cells.
Yes.
And this stops the pancreatic cell from secreting insulin. And on the other side, the excess fat causes the liver cells not to produce enough insulin receptors or defective receptors. So the insulin doesn't act well on the liver cells. Bottom line is liver produces too much glucose, and not enough insulin is secreted from the pancreatic cells to stop this process from happening. So you put it to test. How did you do that?
Well, in order to test this hypothesis, I had to find a way of getting people living their normal lives to lose about 15 kilograms in weight in a short period so we could do this study. And I've been sitting in my clinic for many decades, listening to patients explain why it's difficult to lose weight. And there are two main items that had come out as being the most common ones mentioned. The first was hunger. People don't like being hungry, so we had to get around that. The second was the burden of choice of what to eat, how much to eat, every meal, every day. And that was a cumulative burden, despite me, and it gets people down and they give up and they go back to just eating normal.
Okay.
So, to get around both those big issues, I devised a diet using dietary replacement products, just one packet per meal. So, no choice apart from the flavor. And that was well accepted, but also on 800 calories a day. Very small amount.
This is nothing.
Calorie intake. The hunger effectively disappears after about 2 days. So on a less than 1,000 calories a day, hunger is much less of a problem. And I already knew that from very, very old studies using very low calorie intake. They were not wise studies, but they reported that a long time ago. So I put all this together and we developed the rapid weight loss method. And I thought during this initial study, I would spend the entire time trying to motivate people to lose weight. Not a bit of it. People actually liked this approach. They started feeling much better within a week.
Okay.
And the commonest comment I got back was, I feel 10 years younger.
Great.
Because, of course, every time you get up, you're lifting your total body weight. And if you're losing substantial amounts of weight, then you soon start noticing a big difference.
Mm-hmm.
And on the 800 calories a day diet, the average weight loss in the first week is 4 kilograms. Half of that is water, half is fat. But in the second week onwards, it's almost all fat. So we have a very clear way forwards using a nutritionally complete formula in the packet meals, and something that's acceptable to people and manageable in their everyday life, going about work and play. People can do this.
Okay. So how many people were in the study?
Because we were predicting such a dramatic effect, a complete normalization of glucose, normalization of fat, we only needed a relatively small number of people to show whether the idea was right or wrong. So the protocol was for 14 people to be recruited, and I expected 2 or 3 people to drop out.
Okay.
So the final group was 11.
Okay.
And I have to say, the results were astonishing. From the very first person who came through, we were amazed, because fasting glucose was normal within 7 days. We were doing other tests to measure what was happening, and we demonstrated that the liver insulin sensitivity went from being very poor low to being completely normal for 7 days. Now, of course, the liver is a very active organ.
Yes.
It can mobilize fat very rapidly, and it can go back to normal very fast.
Okay.
So this was a revolutionary finding. We had separated out the insulin resistance in the liver, which was completely able to be resolved. That in muscle was untouched. And over the whole 8 weeks of this study period, and in subsequent studies, muscle insulin sensitivity doesn't change. It's largely a genetic characteristic. Yes, fat has an effect, but it's a small effect, and it doesn't appear acutely. But at the end of our study, which is called the counterpoint study, we were able to say the hypothesis stands. Type 2 diabetes is certainly reversible. Everybody went back to normal in that study.
Okay.
And the counterpoint study was published in 2011 and caused a big stir.
So at that time, this was proof of concept.
Yes.
So then you carried it out in a much larger study.
Well, several studies, because people criticized the counterpoint study because we had only looked at the acute weight loss period, and the final study was at the end of 8 weeks on this low-calorie diet. And several things happened, one of which was our research volunteers reporting back to us that the most difficult part of the whole weight loss business was getting back to eating normal food, having been on this very easy diet for 8 weeks. They found that a challenge. That caused us to rethink what we were doing, and ever since we've used a 3-phase approach.
Yes.
First phase, a rapid weight loss. Second phase, a slow, stepped return to eating normal foods, but at a different level than before. People needed to be eating about 3/4 of the amount they used to eat, because now they're a smaller animal. They need less food for their basal metabolism. And then phase 3 is long-term maintenance, and that is supportive, and that is still a challenging phase. But we used that approach in our next 2 studies, which established, yes, this wasn't a acute starvation effect. When people went back to normal eating, 6 months later, the diabetes was still got, and all the changes of the liver and everything else were back to normal. So that was a big thing. The other thing we showed was that this was duration dependent. So in that particular study, people who had type 2 diabetes for more than 10 years didn't go back to normal. Lots improved. There were improvements, but they didn't achieve normal. Whereas people in the first 6 years were almost certain to go back to normal. And so that's where all our subsequent work used people within 6 years of diagnosis. And it was at that point we devised the big study, the direct study, which has such an...
Before we go to that study, unfortunately, the time of this episode has ended. We shall continue with the next episode because the direct is one of the major landmarks, phenomena which changed the face of diabetes. Thank you, Professor, and we shall continue in the next video.